Good morning, or perhaps good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Regardless, thank you so much for taking the time today to join us for our session. My name is Coral Owen. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator for the Military Families Learning Network. In case you're joining us for the first time, I'd like to give you a brief tour of our webinar platform so you can find your way around. Hopefully you're currently able to view the slides we're sharing. If you can't see them or have any other technical difficulties today, please send us a tech support request via email to milfamln@gmail.com. We'll place this email address in the chat here momentarily for your convenience. As some of you have already done, we do look forward to having you join us in the chat pod today for conversation and for questions. To embed the chat so you don't miss any links or conversations, simply place your cursor over the shared slides. You should then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of your screen, and then from there, just select the chat bubble icon. When typing your comments and questions, please be sure to select the Everyone Response option from the drop-down menu. You can find that right above where it says Type Message here. This just ensures everyone who is on today's session can see those as they come through in the chat pod. We'll also be covering evaluation and continuing education information at the end of today's session. Additionally, if you would like to download a copy of the webinar slides and supporting event materials, you can find those on the event page. Note that closed captioning is available for today's webinar. If you'd like to receive an accurate transcript, please just send us an email to request an accurate transcript. The Military Families Learning Network is part of a DoD-USDA partnership for military families. Our passion is to connect military family service providers and cooperative extension professionals to research and to each other through innovative online programming. It's my pleasure to now turn things over to my colleague, Helene Gobel. She's the program coordinator with the MFLN Family Development Team.
Hello, thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin the presentation, we did want to note that this presentation has been a collaboration with the National Center on Sexual Behavior of Youth and their team. So we want to thank Dr. Jane Solofsky and her team at the SBCY for their work on this webinar. This session is also based on work supported by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, Office of Justice Programs, and U.S. Department of Justice. So we thank our colleagues at the DoD, OJJDP, OJP, and DOJ for their work and oversight on this presentation and their continued support for the series. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Ingrid Marley. She has worked in the provision of mental health services for over 30 years, using her bilingual and bicultural skills to facilitate work with Latino families. As a social worker, she assisted with emergency work and child protective services, working with the police and other departmental needs at the Department of Social Services. She has worked with the Children's Institute for the last 22 years, providing direct clinical services to hundreds of children and families who have experienced child abuse, neglect, and family and community violence. Additionally, she provides expertise in working with victims of sexual abuse and youth with problematic sexual behaviors. In her current role at the National Center on Child Traumatic Stress clinical training manager at the Children's Institute, she primarily focuses on raising the standard of care to improve services to traumatized children, their families, and communities in Los Angeles, California. Ingrid also serves as senior clinical specialist, consultant, and training and technical assistant as a team member at NCSBY. I did want to also reiterate before I officially hand things over to Ingrid that I will be covering continuing education credit information at the end of today's session. So please stay tuned if you would like that information, and please refer to the chat pod and visit the event page if you have not already for today's webinar for a copy of today's presentation, as well as some additional resources that will provide supplemental materials for today's session. So it is my honor to turn things over to Ingrid to officially begin today's session.
Firstly, thank you all for the honor of this opportunity and for your time today as we continue our talks on problematic sexual behavior and focus our talk today on the area of importance to each one of us, culture. Attention has increasingly been given to the role of culture in the healthcare field as different parts of the world continue to become increasingly diverse and multicultural. Healthcare providers have been encouraged to become aware of cultural differences and their impact on health. And borrowing from Dr. Bruce Perry's work, he summed it up best to say, our work is about really listening to people. It's about getting to know who you're working with, where they come from, how they reach decisions. This understanding helps us as providers to potentially lead to an informed response. So perhaps instead of coming from judgment and a punitive position, coming from one of curiosity and compassion. So as we talk about culture today, what comes to mind when you think of culture? And you can go ahead and put in the chat pod some of your thoughts. When you think of culture, what does that mean to you? Shared understandings. Yeah, tradition. Absolutely. Very good. For a lot of us, we immediately think of what's right in front of us: language, different clothing, also diverse food. For me, I draw on some of the most significant cultural memories of my own childhood. A mother who danced flamenco and played castanets to entertain me. A family making tamales at Christmas time. And now I look to ways how I infuse culture into raising my daughter, such as passing on a Spanish lullaby that my mom sang to me. And I see folks have also said learned behavior, beliefs, absolutely. So when we think about culture, the other piece is, how do we connect culture? How does that connect to healing and recovery? Despite our immediate thoughts on culture, culture also impacts a person's beliefs, as has been said in the chat pod, norms and values. It impacts how you view certain ideas and behaviors. Working with clients in general can be a new learning experience, especially if their cultural background is different from our own. For example, as someone whose background is Latina, my upbringing has prepared me to better serve people who share my cultural background. Nevertheless, my experience and my experiences have made me aware of further areas of growth in serving my clients. There are differences within my own mixed culture. In the case of mental health, it can impact whether or not you seek help, what type of help you seek, and what support you have around you. Borrowing from NCSBY, having a child with sexual behavior problems is terribly stressful for any parent. This stress is amplified when one's child is a teen and legal consequences are more likely. Despite our children being flooded with sexual images from media, sex remains a topic that feels taboo and is often hard for parents to discuss. As we consider our response to problematic sexual behavior, the inclusion of many factors of importance for treatment come to mind. Interestingly, as we develop our plans, culture is one factor that often gets overlooked. And when we talk about healing, the conventional medical model that constructs it is a blend of the practitioner's expertise and the patient's client's role, connecting to a belief system that promotes good thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. On one hand, we have conventional approaches, which bring with it the best science and research offers. And on the other hand, we have healing traditions and views we bring with us that challenge our perspective. Our behaviors rise to the expectations of our beliefs. For the goal for us today is to offer a balanced, practical, and applicable perspective to help you feel more confident and competent on matters of multicultural awareness and diversity, and how that influences working with families that have been impacted by problematic sexual behavior of children and youth. Often we hear things like, I don't have enough expertise working with this population. I don't know how to meet the needs of that population, or I don't want to accidentally offend others while trying to help. The response: we may not be cultural experts. There is more to cultural awareness than having the experience of one type of minority group, and being a part of an ethnic minority doesn't necessarily make someone knowledgeable about other cultures involving different genders, sexual orientations, ages, abilities, religious beliefs, socioeconomic statuses, etc. We have an ethical and professional responsibility to accept that we don't know everything, to value what we do know, and to make the most of every opportunity to learn. This will not be a history lesson, a political debate on everything you need to know about, or a specific treatment plan. The more we know about various cultural experiences, values, and ways of being, the more competent and effective we can become at helping to identify sources of struggles and appropriate solutions to those struggles. We will look at breadth versus depth. Our journey of growth continues, and we are each responsible. Today, we'll look at a quick overview of cultural identity and look at how it influences views of mental health. We'll specifically focus on the role of military family culture. We will look at how health-related beliefs, practices, and cultural values influence the understanding of problematic sexual behavior. We'll look at the influence of cultural values on access to treatment and understand how cultural competence, humility, and reflexivity can increase our effectiveness as providers. As culturally competent providers, I wanted to go over a few, I'm seeing the slide, I wanted to go over a few of the working definitions that we have and review that. With NCSBY, the definition for problematic sexual behaviors, and you'll hear me refer to problematic sexual behaviors or PSB interchangeably. Here are the definitions for that. And through Military Families Learning Network, the definition is behaviors initiated by children and youth under the age of 18 that involve sexual body parts in a manner that deviates from normative or typical sexual behavior and are developmentally inappropriate and or potentially harmful to the individual initiating the behavior or others. So things we hope to walk away with today, recognizing limitations. This means having a sense that one's own knowledge is limited as to what truly is another's culture. For example, I am a Latina woman. This does not mean that I know everything there is to Latino, Hispanic, or Latinx culture. We are an expansive group with an expansive variety of cultures, customs, and traditions. It is an honor to be here today, yet I will not profess to be completely knowledgeable about military culture. My oldest brother was a Green Beret, while as a family, we hold pride in his service, yet it does not give me an exclusive view of encompassing knowledge of all that entails the military. As we will discuss, and as I have shared in my background, the military is also expansive in its branches, each with its own set of culture, custom, and traditions. So, ongoing steps. What do we do to manage our limitations? Firstly, awareness. That's hard work. We challenge ourselves towards introspection to explore and identify our own biases and perceptions. The way we are raised shapes us. We are more likely to give in to our biases when under pressure. So it helps to practice ways to reduce stress and increase mindfulness. Conversely, self-awareness is also being other-oriented rather than self-focused. The more aware we are, we can check our messaging. For example, at the height of the pandemic, we also experienced many protests. At the store one day with my daughter, we found ourselves aisle after aisle running into a gentleman with a hat that read, "All Lives Matter." In that moment, I had a choice. I had a choice to ignore this or make this a teachable moment for my preteen who had been actively engaged in reading various books on social justice that summer. I took that moment. We discussed the concept of all lives matter, and we discussed all Black lives matter and where that comes from. And then circling back around to the message on this man's hat and what we take away in that moment. We have choices. We can be respectful of differences, yet awareness is important. And I took that moment for my family. Secondly, knowledge. Learn, read, watch content, or directly interact with others to gain perspective. Keep trying to learn and expand knowledge. Ask questions if you don't know. And importantly, thirdly, sensitivity. Consider experiences from the point of view of the other person. Are we feeding into stereotypes? Evaluate people based on their personal characteristics rather than those affiliated with their group, connecting over shared interests, commonalities. There are problems with categorization. People don't always fit into categories. Many individuals identify with several racial and ethnic backgrounds. Let's learn to slow down before interacting with people from certain groups, pause, reflect, to reduce reflexive actions. Consider positive examples of people from that stereotyped group. For example, when talking about problematic sexual behavior, I often hear, "How can you work with offenders? How can you work with those kids?" My response, I work with them because they are kids. So being open to adjusting your own way of thinking and adopting an attitude of gratitude. And by gratitude, I will tell you that I have information to share with you today, and I may not always get things right, but I am open. And I remain open and look forward to new knowledge I may take away at any time. We are all guests learning another's way of life. And so I see in the chat pod a comment as well, like not being colorblind, but seeing color and culture and respecting how that impacts and influences others. So starting off, we will focus our attention on an overview of cultural identity and how it influences views of mental health, keeping in mind the role of military family culture. Demographics continually change, as do the people you encounter each day. Our families, communities, cities, and country are changing. The world is changing. As culturally competent providers, it is important that we expand our comfort zones. We all have a home base. We have that personal home base, that professional home base, those things we experience as normal, comfortable, easy. However, I find it important to understand the complexities of identities. There is diversity among us, and collectively a group identity leading into the dynamic nature of our children and our youth's experiences. Let's learn and examine other belief systems, including understanding the complexity of identities, that even in sameness, there are differences. And why examine culture? Well, it's beneficial to branch out of what's comfortable, out of that home base, that comfort zone, learn about someone else, learn someone else's normal, and make efforts to meet the needs to someone new to you. We also have professional mandates in mental health. Cultural competence is one of the things that we all are required to get trained in. And cultural competence leads to greater client satisfaction and rapport, making that effort to help your clients feel seen and understood. That's the core of building a therapeutic rapport. Greater treatment effectiveness. When a client feels understood, they are more likely to be more open to treatment strategies and recommendations. With this call to learn from each other at the same time, we are learning. However, no need to feel the pressure that we need to learn everything about everyone. That's a tall order. So as I sat down to put my thoughts on paper and put my thoughts together for today's talk, I turned to the basics, the definition of cultural identity. Cultural identity reveals a person's heritage, embracing all the traditions that have been passed down through history, as well as to help identify with others who have the same traditions or similar belief structures. The Army defines culture as a dynamic social system containing the values, beliefs, behaviors, and norms of a specific group. Culture is the foundation on which everything else is built. When we think of our youth, our middle schoolers, culture is a dynamic nature of their experience in the world. We think about where they are developmentally. Things are changing for them so fast, and they are exploring what fits and what doesn't fit for them. The big question for them at this age is, who am I? Culture gives us that framework of belonging, and it guides us in how we respond to the world around us. It begins with family. Starting at a very young age, we embrace the traditions and norms of our parents and grandparents, and we hold on to them as we grow older. It sets the rules of how we interact, shared beliefs and goals. Respect, or in Spanish, respeto. Each military branch also has its own set of moral codes, such as honor, courage, and strength, which affect the service member's personal and professional outlook. There's commitment to family, choice in language, respectful language with each other. How do we communicate with each other? An understanding of each other's wishes and feelings all fall under respect. And under this umbrella of respect, I've also included privacy. There are levels of privacy, particularly considering problematic sexual behavior. What is the level of respect and privacy in your home? For example, dressing modestly versus not. I share an example with you of years ago. I placed a young woman in a foster home, and as she was settling in, she went to take her shower, and her foster dad arrived home from work and sat himself down and opened up the newspaper to read the paper. In those days, we still had newspapers. And she thought she was going to get a rise, I think hoping that she was going to get herself kicked out or something so that she could be placed where she thought she wanted to be. So she came out completely nude. And bless this man, without missing a beat, without looking up from his newspaper, he just said, "Young lady, in this house we dress for dinner." She turned right back around, marched into her room, got dressed, and they never had another issue with that. He set that boundary and that expectation. This is the culture in this house. Roles is another important aspect of family culture. Each person has a distinct role. It's important when we work with families to pay close attention to the rules around this. Who leads? Does someone start the conversation? Who is the decision maker in the family? That is the person who may be the gatekeeper who we really want to engage when working with problematic sexual behavior. We also look at relationships. How do members in a family get along? How do we treat each other? Closeness, how caring and loyal, trust, supportive for each other. For example, as a family with problematic sexual behavior, we may say, "I may not condone the actions and problematic sexual behavior, yet I will stand by you and participate in treatment with you," versus, I want him out of here. With problematic sexual behavior, our families may need help navigating relationships, particularly if the behavior is between siblings. As a family, we stick together. So if that's our motto, as a family, we stick together. As a parent, how do I support my child who is acted upon? And at the same time, how do I support my other child when I am so angry at him? Affection is another aspect of family culture. How you show you care. This comes up in many ways. How we physically nurture and show affection changes as kids get older. When I think about this, I always think of a situation we had in our group treatment program for problematic sexual behavior. Every time we had a combined group session, we had a mom and her son come in, and they were physically entwined around each other. I mean, physically entwined. Their arms and their legs were wrapped around each other. It got to the point where it was so distracting for other families and for our facilitators. So we ended up having a meeting with them, opened a discussion about how affection is expressed in their family, what their beliefs are, and wanted to get a little bit more of a sense of them and where they were coming from. And as we were speaking, there's no other way to describe it, but this mom had this light bulb moment. And she just looked at me and her eyes got wide and she was like, I need to adjust and I need to shift. My son's getting older. We are creating new norms. We are creating new rules here in the group, and we need to change how we're teaching boundaries. It didn't mean that there couldn't be affection, just how are we going to shift that and change that to the growing needs of the individual members? And then communication. Is there honesty? Do we listen to each other in a family? So as we think about traditions, what are your family traditions or ways for teaching children rules of the world? You can go ahead and put something in the chat pod. But come to think of it, let us know what your family traditions are. How do you teach children rules of the world? Leading by example, absolutely. That's a very important way of teaching. Very good. So in another one I have here, just this sentence, in this house. Yes, I see in the chat pod, giving them faith and trust. Absolutely, very important, faith and trust. Creating space for communication. Absolutely. How do we know what each one is thinking if we aren't communicating with each other? Very good points. We have big celebrations for each holiday. We tend to use examples from faith and examples from the community when teaching values and norms. Powerful. Yes, everyday examples, very important. And those celebrations really honor tradition by going to church, reading the Bible, open communication. I love this. So I've got this slide up here in this house, this complete the sentence, kind of also a message about rules of family, another way of teaching our values and culture. In this house, we honor our parents. As my foster dad had said to the young lady, in this house, we dress for dinner. In this house, we have each other's backs. In this house, clear is kind, unclear versus is unkind, yes. In this house, we help each other. We build each other up. We respect each other. This is another subtle way of how we learn and how we teach what the rules are and the values. And I have found myself mirroring that. I love this. In this house, I see in the chat pod, we respect each other's opinions. Exactly. We may not agree, but we respect each other's opinions. Navigating this myself with my middle schooler, I have found these words coming out of my mouth in recent days as well, and mirroring those that my parents may have said to me as well. So, aspects of cultural identity. On a more global level, aspects of cultural identity is ownership. All the things that establish a means of identifying the person as part of that culture or nationality. Wearing traditional clothes or even eating food that reflects the respective culture. Our names. Think about your name. How did you get your name? Our names shape our identity. Your name is crucial. My first and middle name, Ingrid Elizabeth, come from my great-grandmothers, my German great-grandmothers on my father's side. And it creates that sense of identity. And I think everyone has a story about how they got their names. But other aspects of culture are nationality as well. The country we're born into, or even the country that person currently lives in. This determines cultural identity because the person adopts the culture of that country. I think of my German father growing up in Colombia, South America, and then adopting the culture there, and then of this country after immigrating to the US as a young man. Ethnicity, a broader term than race to categorize groups of people according to cultural expression and race. Religion, how we practice religion. Religion provides often a code of conduct, a set of moral beliefs and principles related to the existence of God and the world. Religions have a very important role, and it's important that we pay close attention to that role of religion in our client's life. Strong religious beliefs may have central influence on the view of mental health, which impacts how the therapist is viewed as well. So what is their view? of mental health, and in turn, their view of the therapist. We'll discuss further momentarily, but I add here sexuality and sex education. What is the religious view and how might this influence the family? There's a cross interaction here with that as well, with religion. But faith plays an important role, and religion can set the tone for the family as a whole. God comes first. For Latinos, there may be a concept known as fatalism, which refers to the belief that divine providence governs the world. Exploring an individual's possible magical explanations of mental and emotional problems is also important, as emotional problems might be seen by some as being caused by bad spirits or witchcraft. I had a mom bring her son in to treatment, and she was convinced. She told me she thought her son was possessed. For her, this was her explanation. Why else would he engage in this behavior? Well, this opened a dialogue for us to help understand her beliefs and gently share information about what we know about problematic sexual behavior. It helped us have that exchange. For the military, one of the aspects that sets the US military apart from civilian counterparts is its values philosophy. Very important in terms of cultural identity. Other aspects of cultural identity as well, when we look at locality. The place where one lives impacts the culture that person abides by. Many immigrants find the need to change their culture in order to fit in. And this can conflict with an immigrant's current belief in their culture and might pose a problem compelling a need to choose. For example, my family members had different experiences immigrating to the US. Most of my cousins do not speak Spanish, as their parents held on to the need to fit in and lead with English. At the time, my aunts and uncles defined it as pride in their new country. The nature of the impact of culture has changed, however, with the advent of the internet. The internet brings together groups of people with shared cultural interests. This plasticity is what allows people to feel like part of a society wherever they go. For problematic sexual behavior, I think it's important to look at how is this viewed? How is it handled in your community? Each community has its own set of rules. For example, I'm in Los Angeles, and one of the things that I have found out here is that we quickly found different systems applying several approaches, from downplaying the behavior to taking a position of let's remove the child, put them in a foster home or a group home, perhaps a group home with no focused treatment, or let's apply an adult offender model. So lots of different views for a similar situation. Language is another main component of cultural identity. It also includes the way people speak with peers, family members, authority figures, and strangers, including the tone and familiarity that is included in the language. Language learning process can also be affected by cultural identity via the understanding of specific words, the preference for specific words when learning and using a second language. I'll tell you, my mother was an extremely eloquent and well-read woman in English, yet her initial foray into the English language found her in the early 1960s telling everyone in a small Virginia town that she was a fast woman, when what she meant was she's a quick learner. When I look at language with the military, encountering military culture has been compared to navigating a foreign country with its own language. Each of the 5 military branches has its own set of terms and acronyms that relate to job title, position, location, services, time, and resources for military service members and their families. With kids and youth, we may also find ourselves frequently asking and or looking up new words. As my child comes home from school, I believe we have a new word almost daily or weekly that I am learning. What is that term? What is she talking about? There's a whole new language now in middle school. For problematic sexual behavior, think about what terms come to mind for you when you hear problematic sexual behavior. What are the terms that come to mind? I think there's an importance in terms of creating sensitivity to language. It's very important because it can shape our views and beliefs in others and ourselves. How we refer to people may influence how they are seen and how they take that on. For education, there's a whole cultural identity has a direct impact on the way children perform in education. So children's performance in education can be described by the following examples. There are, in Asian cultures, there is a value of quiet in class and considering it inappropriate to make eye contact with the teacher. However, in European cultures, there is a high value placed on active classroom discussion, maintaining that eye contact to reflect respect and engagement. With education, again, I throw in sex ed. Once again, I add this element. Is it happening here? Is it happening in education and in schools? When we think about schools, there is a grade level culture for children and youth. We have transitioned to middle school, and there is a whole new world here. My child is now navigating lockers, changing for physical education, friend groups, clubs, electives, clothes, hair, things that weren't so important in elementary suddenly are front and center. And as I think about that, I also think about the role of boundaries and privacy rules in school. For kids, as they start preschool, what is forefront on the mind are those boundaries and privacy rules. With my own child, I remember pulling out a book, Some Parts Are Not for Sharing, immediately talking about boundaries and privacy, and going over the rules around restroom use. Only one person at a time goes into the restroom. Then as elementary school hits, sleepovers start. Who changes where? I have a fond memory overhearing my child mapping out with one of her first sleepovers with a friend, mapping out who was going to go where to change so that everyone had their privacy. Middle school, gym. How do I change my gym clothes in front of everyone? That's such a big deal for middle schoolers. And how do we teach those boundaries? How do we teach those privacy rules? There's a whole culture for kids. We can't ignore aspects of cultural identity without also looking at virtual culture. There is a set of phenomena that occur in conjunction between virtual culture, understood as the modes and norms of behavior associated with the internet and online world, and youth culture. I refer to and have heard the term of screenagers. I don't have a teen, I have a screenager. Suddenly there is a device that becomes an extension of their bodies. So they are on all the time. While we can speak of a duality between the virtual online and real sphere, face-to-face relationships, for our youth, this frontier is implicit and permeable. On occasions, to the annoyance of parents and teachers, young people might be in the real world without ceasing to be connected. So boundaries and privacy when it comes to a virtual culture. Digital citizenship. How do we teach digital citizenship? This is often a challenge when our kids become our IT experts in the home. And so that creates some challenge around that. I'm introducing you today to the diversity wheel. This was created by the Diversity Leadership Council at Johns Hopkins University in 2020, last year. And it was an effort to visually represent a broad scope of diversity. They propose that some cultural expressions are permanent or visible, such as race or ethnicity and gender, while others are acquired and change over the course of a lifetime, such as family role and income. There's a glaring omission on this diversity wheel, and I'm just wondering if anyone can spot it. Well, it's the military. Where is the military on here? If I could redesign, I would add another segment with the military, with its own set of culture. And this is my version of the expanded wheel of diversity to include the military. With a wheel of diversity, there are some benefits. The wheel reminds us to consider more than just race and ethnicity when examining the role diversity plays in our efforts as helping professionals. There are challenges. Some express aversion to the wheel because it can also be used to limit people by labels. It doesn't take into account other factors such as geographic region, special talents, or values. How do you identify yourself? How would you describe yourself if you were looking at a diversity wheel? What are 3 things about yourself? As I look at it, for me, number 1, I am a woman. Number 2, a mom. And 3, Latina. My gender identity and ethnicity utilize that inner dimension of the wheel, and family utilizes that outer dimension. I have just described ways I am similar to some of you today, and at the same time, different from some of you. Awareness and sensitivity to how folks identify is important for us. It's pervasive in all we do. And as we turn our attention to military culture, let's take a closer look at that segment of the diversity wheel that would encompass such a broad category as the military. Military culture is a dynamic culture. The decision to belong is a conscious one. Each branch of the United States military has its own set of core values that members of that branch are expected to live by. Within each branch, there are also subcultures: infantry, special forces, medical providers. And across the branches, there's an order and disciplined social environment through its beliefs, values, and attitudes. Those core values, moral codes, affect the service members' personal and professional outlook. They define how service members live their lives, make decisions both on and off the battlefield, as well as overcome daily challenges and adversity. It crosses over to family. From the first day that a new recruit enters into military service, these values are introduced and then taught and enforced on a daily basis. The intention of these values is to increase cohesion and camaraderie, pride, and a common loyalty. For our PSB groups, we have a similar way of bringing in new members where each new member comes in being given a set of expectations, group expectations. These are the rules we follow, bringing them in to start teaching them the culture of the group and the expectations of what they will be expected to follow while they participate. Again, military culture is definitely unique. As we look at the what sets aside military culture, it holds distinctive challenges for its service members and their family members. It's viewed as a profession. However, the military extends into that service member's world, affecting everyday lifestyle and the lifestyle of family members with all of its key cultural elements. For military dependents, family, though each branch's core values vary slightly, the purposes are the same: to establish a standard of expectations, conduct, and governance over the service member's life and family as well. Military families have a unique lifestyle. including values, norms, stressors, and risk factors that may vary from civilian population. As we discussed, language, own set of terms and acronyms, hierarchy, rank and order are important with service members, showing respect for and compliance with their superiors. This structure may be mimicked in the military family's home life as well. And for example, in all families, there is a sense of hierarchy and head of household. In mine, it was my father who was the head of household, yet mom clearly was the gatekeeper and who we needed to ask permission for things. If dad got involved, it definitely meant a higher order of things taken to a whole nother level. Military rank can also impact family members' identity and sense of self as they identify with their position in the military community. Rules and regulations. These are clearly defined rules and expectations for military service members and their families, including guidelines for spouses and children regarding dress and behavior in public. There are different sets of conduct around higher ranking service members. There are implications when we fail to abide by rules and expectations. When I talk about self-expectations, military members and family members take a sense of pride in their ability to overcome challenges. Military culture promotes strength and emotional control. And self-sacrifice. Military family members face numerous deployments, relocations, and separation from each other. And I like this quotation, when something happens, we are a big family. We take care of each other. It's this, we're going to dig in and we're going to come together, is a huge strength of commitment and loyalty. I'm sharing with you today this tool that I use. It's called the Digital Protective Shield. And this comes from NCTSM, a National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and a curriculum we use there on the core curriculum on childhood trauma. This is based on problem-based learning. It incorporates looking at ecological factors that influence a person's functioning. Another way to look at adversities versus protective shield of factors, supporting children, youth, and families. This can be another tool to be able to identify all the factors impacting the families we work with. But as I was reflecting on this, I was also looking at supportive factors for the military family. And we would be able to list out a number of protective factors, such as at least one parent is employed. There's benefits of healthcare. There's support for housing. There is access to some of the best childcare centers in the country. Military childcare is a model of care. And there's a great sense of community. So a lot of supportive factors come in. Cultural diversity across the world has significant impacts on the many aspects of mental health, ranging from the ways in which mental health and illness are perceived, health-seeking behavior, attitudes of the consumers as well as the practitioners and mental health systems. Culture influences what gets defined as a problem, how that problem is understood, and which solutions to the problem are acceptable. Respect, again, it's an essential component and helps create a healthy environment where clients and families feel cared for as individuals and members of the healthcare team. This will be nuanced in different ways across various cultures. Health-related beliefs. Cultures often have different beliefs regarding this. Some may hold high value in the professionals, while others hold high distrust levels and distrust in traditional approaches. Most families may not have a clear understanding of what counseling is and what is involved. Simply, they may not understand the reasons why they must go to treatment or the entire process of engaging services and participating. There may also be fear in accessing services. For problematic sexual behavior, I often hear, is this really a problem? Do we really need to talk about this? So I look at, is the behavior being minimized? We've heard from time to time, boys will be boys statements. You know, boys. However, I am seeing this change in recent years. We can often link, I find when I hear these statements like this, I often link it back to that culture of respect, because culture of respect includes boundaries and privacy with each other. And what are appropriate boundaries for each person? How do we respect each other? So when I'm hearing questions about problematic sexual behavior and questioning, is this something we really need to talk about? Then sometimes I circle back, approaching it from an element of respect. For some parenting practices, we really see some of these elements as holding high value, an element of obedience, following commands, accepting rules without question, never disagree with the parents, bad manners to get involved in adult conversations. We also see often deference, courtesy owed to elders that reflects hierarchical aspects, decorum, appropriate behavior for social interactions, particularly formalized situations. Good morning, please, thank you, good night, greeting others formally. In public behavior, what are the set of boundaries imposed on behavioral expression of children in public situations? We must present well to others, particularly in public. Children often are seen as a reflection of the entire family, and this may also apply to military families. And particularly if we have problematic sexual behavior coming in, that is another element of shame that we'll discuss shortly in terms of children being seen as a reflection of the entire family. So the response, if there is a problem, if there is an incident, if the child or youth has been identified as having problematic sexual behavior, how might parents respond? Think about your own response and go ahead and put something in the chat box. What do you think your response would be? I see worry, anger, fear, sad, shock, absolutely. Disbelief, yes. Fear, lots of fear, yeah. I can think, if it were my own response, all the education in the world, everything that I know, devastation, yes. Nausea, yeah, strong reactions. I think all the education in the world that I might have would go out the window when it comes to my own child. Parents coming in are often feeling all these things you've described. That devastation, that fear, that shock, nausea. It's important to take a moment to ask them, how are you? When we have gotten feedback, that is the thing that has really stood out for me, is that parents often reflect back. When I came in, they just sat and asked me how I was doing. How are you? And I would even take this a step further, and I like to ask, how has this impacted how you're parenting? What are the thoughts and feelings you may be having as a parent towards your child? Stress, shock, anger. I have a mom who came into treatment, into group, and she could not speak. But initially she sat in group with her arms crossed, just killing me with her look. When it came to the day where parents were sharing what brought them into group, she bowed her head on the table and began to bawl, just wailing. And we gave her space and sat with her in her grief. She eventually was able to speak up, and it was a major turning point in treatment for her. And I'll tell you, at their graduation, their successful graduation from group, she spoke to the new moms coming in who were sitting there looking angry with their arms crossed. And she normalized their response, telling them she was exactly where they are. It gets better. Families do heal. Anger can lead to a strong response with the child or youth, and it can turn into aggressive behavior to try to shut it down. For example, this thought of be a man, chest out, in Spanish, pecho pa fuera, chest out, pull it together. Parents being punitive to have their child fall in line. Well, over-aggressive approaches can also lead to other behavior. The other comment I've often heard also is be normal. I had a father call in inquiring about getting his son into a predators group. After skipping a beat for a moment, and I thought, my goodness, a predators group. What did this 11-year-old do? We took a moment. I helped this father take a step back and asked his permission to share and exchange some information. And I thought it was important in that moment to just sit and ask him to just tell me about your son. What do we know? As a clinician, it was important for me to affirm his feelings, give him space to talk, and then gently guiding him. May I share some information with you about what we know about problematic sexual behavior? It was about helping this family breathe and then providing a reframe and some education around language and some sensitivity to language to help them navigate and engage into services. Military lessons teach us of strengths that we can apply here. This sense of family pulling together. Often there is worry and fear of labels. This could negatively impact their child. Often the question I hear is, what does this mean for my child? There's stigma, an element of shame and embarrassment. In Latino culture and others, family is everything. A view of problematic sexual behavior is bringing shame onto the family. If the behavior involved another family member, such as a cousin, this can tear the family apart. We had a super close family we worked with. Grandparents were deceased, and all the siblings had holidays together, interacted daily. The kids were in and out of each other's homes, and the 12-year-old acted out on a cousin. After the incident, no one was talking. The family became divided and shamed. Our solution was to work with them as a unit. Let's create the space for them to come together and to talk, discuss concerns. Let's provide information, and let's create a safety plan that's comfortable for everyone. Some families may not share with their families that they're seeking services. They might keep that more private. There may be multi-generational conflicts in terms of how to approach. Other PSB implications, if supervision is not addressed during family gatherings, well, are we taking this will act as if there isn't an issue? This often is when we have seen new incidents occurring, potentially leading to things also being overlooked or fear of disclosing, fear of being judged. So families not disclosing to other family members or putting in place additional supervision needs. Conversely, you might also have others believing if I share my problems, I'll share my problems only with family, but no one else. Because if I share them with other people, what will they say? People will gossip. Or there is this thought of, we're tough, we got this. Therapy is not okay. We don't believe in therapy. We're going to handle this. We can do this. A false sense of being able to control or address the situation. And if the legal system's involved, that changes this. I also add history in here. Is there prior trauma history of child sexual abuse or other trauma history? Does the caregiver have personal experience? And is this getting activated now that's influencing that role of their beliefs around health-related practices and engagement in services? And when it comes to information, families frequently lack information and adequate support. So the influence of cultural values on access to treatment. Engaging families into mental health treatment remains a serious challenge despite ongoing advances in treatment. Mental health providers and professionals across the world have to work with clients that are often from different cultures other than their own. Mental health providers and professionals across the world are working with many families, and the differences in cultures have a range of implications for mental health practice, ranging from the way people view health and illness to willingness to seek treatment, accessibility of treatment, how they view the mental health provider and the impact of experiences they may have with racism and discrimination. Yes, I see in the chat pod also there's concern how information will be used and whether it will impact the child access to desired schools, occupations in the future. That is a huge element of stigma, and I'm so glad that was brought up. There are a lot of issues that impact that engagement with services. It can be also particularly exacerbated in communities of low-income urban communities where children are exposed to poverty, community violence, and trauma, where there's high rates of psychosocial stress, as well as insufficient housing, health, and mental health resources. There's a disparity in treatment. It's interesting to me to see how problematic sexual behavior is handled. I've seen similar offenses treated differently with the Department of Children and Family Services, probation, and the court. Family services also impact this. The family resources impact this. Can the family retain an attorney? Can they seek private treatment? If so, we may see the system wipe its hands. This may not be true with public defenders and persons of color. Race, ethnicity, culture, language, geographic region, and other social factors affect the perception, availability, utilization, and potentially the outcomes of mental health services. Families of color and inequities may be fearful of the system. And as providers, we experience more denial, resistance to treatment, resistance to change. We want to engage, yet many of our families have good reason for the distrust based on historical and systemic responses. Think about and recognize what the family may be bringing to the table, so to speak. What is their historical experience? It's important we understand the role cultural values place on seeking and accessing mental health. What does seeing someone like me, a therapist, mean for you and your family? What experiences have you had with mental health services? I want to know the answers to these questions because it will illuminate for me how I may need to proceed with them, how I may need to adjust my approach, what I might need to focus on to help them feel comfortable and safe in this environment. So here are some other ways that culture can impact mental health. Cultural stigma. Every culture has a different way of looking at mental health. For many, there is growing stigma around mental health, and those challenges may be considered as a weakness or something to hide, which will make it harder for those struggling to talk openly and ask for help. There may be stigma in discussing personal business. Don't air your dirty laundry. Also, understanding symptoms or the problem. Culture can influence how people describe and feel about their symptoms. Community support. Is there support within the community, or are they going to feel like they are standing alone? And resources. What resources are readily available? Does pride take a role in this? Will I appear weak if I seek out mental health treatment? Earlier, we discussed military culture promoting the notion of strength and emotional control. For the military family and civilian families, fear of appearing weak, particularly with mental health, could potentially impede the family's sense of comfort in seeking assistance. And so closing the gap, it's important for mental health providers to provide culturally sensible therapeutic services to decrease that underutilization of mental health services. For example, for many Latinos who seek treatment, their first contact with a mental health professional may be their last. 50% never return after their first session. I've added a slide here to focus on sexuality as a cultural factor and how that plays in. Talking with kids about sexual values. How is this communicated in families? How are gender roles communicated in families? Talking with your kids about sex may not be easy, but it's important. And it's never too early to start. Your support can help them make healthy choices as they grow up. We know that kids with problematic sexual behavior often have inaccurate information about sexual topics. They may receive misinformation or confusing information through media. I think about songs, the recent VMA awards, gaming, streaming. What are they streaming on videos, their TikTok, their apps that they are on? Caregivers themselves may not have accurate information. Always have someone, every time we go over this section in treatment, I always have someone come up to say that they learned something new. So again, sex education, how do we educate our children? How does this happen in different families? Is someone in charge of taking this on? Is this assigned to another person or parent or family member? When does this happen? Views of sex ed and sexuality will be influenced by culture. Culturally, Latinos, there's a gender divide. Well, we don't talk about those things. It's considered inappropriate. So this gets limited. Mothers tend to be more of the purveyors of sexual communication. And there are rules around behavior. Sexual values and gender roles can play out. In Latino families that are historically rooted in Christian values, there's a sense of machismo, the idea of what it is to be a man, which can be both positive and negative aspects of that kind of sense of man up. And conversely, with femininity, the set of values, attitudes, beliefs about femininity, Marianismo. In PSB treatment, we have rules of behavior in our sexual behavior rules. It's a start. Often our senior members help teach our incoming members. But sexuality, coming of age, are there traditions in the family? I think about rites of passage. For some Latinos, some celebrate a quinceañera for a girl, her 15, her coming of age. And what other rites of passage are there? And think about your own family system and what rites of passage there may have been. In my household, it had been driving, getting that driver's license, getting keys to be able to take off with implications of increased independence. I see in the chat pod hunting license. That's a significant rite of passage to be able to have a hunting license and all that implies. So rites of passage are very important. And so how does that get handled? And so also when I think about rites of passage in terms of coming of age, it's an acknowledgement of sexual maturity as well. And so think about age of consent. Age of consent varies across states and certainly across countries. In working with PSB, our goal is to empower parents with knowledge and learn how to communicate with their children and youth so that they can in turn define and pass on their values and beliefs on sex and sexuality to children. So as we access mental health services, we've discussed the role of values in the military. It's a big thing, and it can be a sensitive spot, particularly when it comes to families. There is great strength in military families. There is a recognition of purpose and meaning and service, and this creates a sense of identity for families, a unifying sense of meaning and purpose. Military families can be incredibly flexible, creative. Don't sweat the small stuff. unexpected news or deployment, and the position is one of, we can work it out. We can figure out a way to get through this. There's value in recognizing that stronger together. There's resilience. Family readiness is tied into military readiness. Accessing mental health services can be seen as family readiness. Addressing issues of PSB proactively. We can work around that. We can figure out a way to get through this. It's helpful to reflect with families how this might be a big challenge for your family, and what you're sharing says your family has a strong commitment to get through challenges together. What can we do to train to help manage the situation? As we look at cultural competence, the term is a product of the 1960s and the 70s. It's grounded in a socio-political climate of the civil rights movement, and the term became ubiquitous in healthcare, with an assumption that the more knowledge we have about another culture, the greater the competence in practice. And so there's a lot of cultural competence training programs that focuses to learn and examine the patient or research participants' belief systems. And many institutions have made cultural competency training required for clinicians to sensitize them to the special needs and vulnerabilities of different populations. And so there are two fundamental problems with this. And those problems, I would ask you to guess, but I'm going to go ahead and just tell you, it suggests that there's a categorical knowledge a person could attain about a group of people, which leads to stereotyping and bias. Cultural competence values expertise over curiosity. It also denotes that there is an endpoint to becoming fully culturally competent. It assumes cultural knowledge is finite and can be mastered. At its base, we look at cultural humility. This means opening up a conversation in a way that genuinely attempts to understand a person's identities related to race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, education, social needs, and others. It is a lifelong process of self-reflection. We can not only learn about another's culture, but we start with ourselves. One of the first steps towards humility is understanding implicit bias. These are the attitudes and beliefs we are not aware of and can't express. We all have it. It's recognizing how we grew up. It's emotionally charged content. If we can take a step back and understand our own assumptions, personal and systemic conditioned biases and values, and work to look at how we might interact with others, then we can then develop and maintain respectful processes and relationships based on mutual trust. So the overall purpose of cultural humility is to be aware of our own values and beliefs that come from a combination of cultures in order to increase understanding of others. The goal is cultural safety, which is an outcome based on respectful engagement and that recognizes and strives to address power imbalances inherent in the healthcare system. So how do we develop cultural humility? It's an understanding. It is an awareness of the self is central to the notion of cultural humility. An awareness may stem from self-reflective questions. And some of these questions might be, what parts of my identity am I aware of? What are most salient? What parts of my identity are privileged or marginalized? How does my sense of identity shift based on context and settings? What might be my own blind spots, biases? With awareness, a provider can ask questions about how they receive the client and family. Who is this person and how do I make sense of them? What knowledge and awareness do I have about their culture what thoughts and feelings emerge from me about them. And validate and encourage difficult conversations. Let's keep the discussion going. Affirm, validate others when it is brought up. For example, sex ed. If we can talk about this, we can talk about anything, including our differences. And reflexivity. As I talk about reflexivity as an extension of cultural humility, this was a term that was brought on early on in research. It's about that relationship between the researcher and the research subject, and that relationship, the interaction between the two. But on the other hand, it also calls for exploring personal beliefs in order to be more aware of potential judgments that can occur during that space in working with a client, with a family, working with problematic sexual behavior. It's the process of examining oneself as a clinician and the relationship with the client, the relationship between the two of you. It's a circular relationship between cause and effects. It involves examining our conceptual baggage, one's assumptions and preconceptions, and how those affect treatment decisions. How ways our own beliefs and opinions influence the other person, making reference to our artificiality or our errors, our thinking. A quick example, and I know that we are rounding this out in the interest of time, but a quick example, I was working with a caregiver in our PSB program, and we usually met in a therapy room that was set up like a living room. And on one occasion, those rooms were being recarpeted. So we shifted over to my office, and I thought nothing of it in the moment. She was clearly uncomfortable, and our session was quite different, yet we had the level of understanding and we had enough of a relationship that she brought it up. She saw the shift of seeing me in my office with my desk in the room and my diplomas on the wall. We were able to discuss the change, the discomfort of the imbalance. And I made sure from then on that I found another space that was more comfortable for her so that we could resume our sessions with comfort and for her to feel safe. Cultural humility calls on individuals to be flexible and humble enough to let go of false sense of security that stereotyping brings and to explore the cultural dimensions of the experiences of each person. In order to build productive relationships with the participant, the provider must explore beliefs and biases of the client specific to mental health care and participation. So it's that two-way street. What are they bringing into the room, and what am I bringing into the room? Mindfulness involves paying attention to our internal process, focusing on awareness of the present moment, and acknowledging and accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and bodily sensations. Being reflexive often requires an awareness and reflection of what's happening while being present to one's perception and an internal experience in that moment. And so I'll share with you some differences on cultural competence and cultural humility. I have a table here that explains those differences. A culturally competent provider needs to have knowledge and awareness of health-related beliefs, practices, and cultural values of diverse populations. Illness and diagnostic incidence and prevalence among culturally, ethnically diverse populations. Treatment efficacy data, if any, of culturally, ethnically diverse populations. Utilizing one of these frameworks without the other really misses the mark, and effective interventions are going to uphold both cultural competence with cultural humility. Intertwining that cultural humility and competence into mental health care is the ideal. So culture provides the context for all health and social services throughout the human lifespan across conditions, settings, and situations. Culture is a mechanism through which people learn how to be in the world, how to behave, what to value, and what gives meaning to existence. It underlies healthcare delivery at client, provider, and system levels because it is the foundation for expectations, actions, interactions, and meanings of care. At all levels of intervention, from appreciation through explanation, the goal is to respect It's to honor individual personhood and cultural beliefs, values, patterns, and to find ways to bring culturally competent providers and the client together in a meaningful, culturally congruent care. While cultural competence in clinical practice is important, it's also not enough. Not just cultural congruence, but with humility and compassion. This can be a therapeutic moment. With problematic sexual behavior, families come in during a time they may be described as their darkest as a family. Our approach can make all the difference in how that door is open to engage. Let's open space to allow for conversation. Consider the family's experience as a participant. They are the expert to their own experience. I want to thank you all for your time, and I'll open it up to questions and leave you once again with these quotations. Better lives through better choices.
Thank you so much, Ingrid, for that amazing presentation. And we do have a few moments here. If you have any questions, please let us know if you have any questions for Ingrid. Yes, it has been a fantastic session, and that was great information. Thank you so much. And this is definitely a great building block onto our series as we continue on exploring the topic of sexual behavior in children and youth. And we thank you for joining us today. But yes, let us know if you have any questions. Please feel free to put those in the chat pod at this time, and we can make sure Ingrid gets to those. Thank you all. Ingrid, do you have any final comments that you would like to make as I see we don't have any? Yes, so I will make one quick announcement really quick, is that a webinar recording, if you had any issues with today's presentation, accessing it or hopping on or listening to the full presentation, please check back on the event page within 24 to 48 hours. We will have a YouTube replay, an archived recording up on the event page, so you will be able, and thank you, Jason, just popped that link into the chat pod. You will be able to refer back to the webinar event page and get a replay of the full session today, as well as any links and resources. Will all be on that page within 24 to 48 hours. Again, that recording will be made available on the webinar event page. Thank you all. Okay, so it looks like we don't have any questions coming in right now, so I will cover a few housekeeping rules, or a few housekeeping details for our participants today. Thank you so much again, Ingrid, for your time and for your presentation and sharing your extensive work with us on this topic area. So for anyone who joined us today who would like to receive continuing education credits or a certificate of completion for attending today's session, again, we will direct you to the event page. That is going to be a one-stop shop for all things from today's session. On that event page, you will see a purple button like the one currently on the screen. The button will read Continuing Education. Once you click that, you will be taken to an evaluation of today's session. We do ask that you complete that and let us know your thoughts on today's presentation. We do read those and go through those. And if you are wanting to get a continuing education credit from one of the select agencies currently listed on the screen, you will be directed to a list of different certificate options. From there, once you have completed the evaluation, you can either complete the post test or fill out the information for the form it directs you to, depending on the certificate that you hope to obtain. And once you have completed that within 24 to 48 hours, you should receive the certificate to the email that you provided. We do ask, if you do not receive that within 24 to 48 hours, that your first step be to check your spam folder, especially if this is your first time completing a evaluation with us and a certificate. If you check your spam folder and that certificate is not there within that 24 to 48 hours, please feel free to give us an email at mflnfamilydevelopment@gmail.com. Let us know your information and we will work to get you that certification if you have went on the Qualtrics and completed the CE process. Again, please email us at mflnfamilydevelopment@gmail.com if you have any issues with that. As Ingrid did mention, this is part of our greater SBCY series homepage. We do ask if you have not familiarized yourself with that series, that you go to the SBCY series homepage that Jason just popped into the chat pod at this time. You can find archived recordings and YouTube replays of these webinars that are currently listed, as well as see the continuing education credits that are still available for these sessions. We do have another webinar in our series on teens, sexual behavior, and the law. This webinar will discuss ways to effectively communicate with teens and their guardians and families about local laws related to consent, internet pornography, and sexting. And this session will be on Thursday, November 4th, again at 11 a.m. Eastern Time and last until 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You can RSVP for that webinar today and receive the link to hop on. And you can find out a little bit more details on the webinar event page for that session now as well. If you would like to stay connected with us as well as receive day before webinar reminders, then you can subscribe to our mailing list at militaryfamilieslearningnetwork.org/family-development. You can subscribe there and we will keep you in the loop as the series continues to develop and unfold. As well as connect with us on Twitter and social media on Facebook if you would like daily updates, as well as daily resources and more information about other things and programming that our Greater Military Families Learning Network has. If you are having any issues today with today's presentation, please do send us an email at Military Families Learning Network, and we will be popping that email in the chat pod here shortly, and we will make sure that we assist any issues you may have. And again, to acquire CEs, please check the event page for today's webinar. That information will be under the continuing education credit, as well as a list of agencies that we are providing CE credits for today. Thank you so much. And to officially wrap things up, I will turn things over to Coral. And thank you so much again, Ingrid, and the team with Jane Solofsky over at NCSBY and all of the work that you have done and continue to share with us in our community.
Thank you so much, Kaylin. Another massive thank you to Ingrid for your time and expertise today, as well as to everyone who joined in our conversation today and this experience. So a friendly reminder, if you saw a couple inquiries in the chat pod, if you did wish to receive a transcript of today's webinar, simply send us a request via email to milfamln@gmail.com. Thank you again for joining us. We're going to stay on for just a moment or two longer. And if you need to reference any information regarding this session, again, please refer to the event page. That's your one-stop shop for event materials, the recording, supporting resources, and continuing education opportunities. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day. All right, not seeing any additional comments come through in the chat pod. So again, if you need anything or you think of something later, please just feel free to email us at our Military Families Learning Network email address or the Family Development Team directly. Wishing you a wonderful day, rest of your week, and a great weekend. Thank you.